thinking in parallel, the misuse of aspirin in treating meningitis. My title, I hope, makes it obvious where I'm coming from and going to. If not, I hope you'll never need to give me first aid. But let me reinforce it with another parallel. Recently, I was talking to someone at a national ecological laboratory in Europe, which has just built a new eco-building, where energy is conserved and waste recycled, and everyone is supposed to feel very virtuous. But the problem has been that the composting bacteria for the toilet wastes have not been doing the job very well. To try to discover why, the staff were all asked to say anonymously what medicines, pills, nostrums, and other substances they were taking or using, and therefore potentially excreting. The results were staggering. Virtually everyone was taking several medicines each day, even the young and apparently sane and healthy, and most of the pills could have been substituted by a sensible diet and other social ways of dealing with the abnormal stresses now placed on everyone, not least in science, by governments and administrations driven by growth economies. The parallel in lakes, of course, is that we approach the problem of eutrophication, which is ultimately driven by the same misplaced economic ideas, not by tackling the cause and avoiding the problem, but by trying to treat the symptoms and therefore causing a string of further problems without properly solving the first one. The idea that we can tackle the problem of too much phosphorus in lakes by using a cocktail of substances that simply bind the phosphate in the sediment or precipitate it from the water is obviously attractive to administrations that want quick results and an industry that will happily make a profit from any opportunity. But it is a fundamentally flawed approach which perpetrates a philosophy that has already got us into an environmental mess. Cloud cuckoo land, where we now all live, is very dangerous territory. My objections are not primarily that the substances used are toxic, though they might be, and the eco-toxicological techniques currently used undoubtedly sometimes, perhaps often, maybe always, miss side effects that could be much more profound than whether chlorella, daphne or zebrafish keel over in a laboratory. My objection is that a short-term fix is not a good solution, but more importantly, it helps inhibit thinking about proper solutions to the much bigger problem of which lake eutrophication is a tiny part. The proper solution to eutrophication is obviously to reduce the nutrient loads. There are, of course, two main sources, the point and the diffuse. There is no longer an excuse, though, for every wastewater treatment works not to have efficient nutrient removal. The technology exists, there is even a market for the phosphorus removed, and there is an urgent need to recycle it. Mineable phosphate deposits are fast running out, and mining has major environmental costs, which apply also, of course, to the substances being proposed as a panacea for treating lakes. There is also the backing of the Urban Wastewaters Treatment Directive. It has its flaws, but other European states have quite correctly considered that all their waterways are potentially sensitive to eutrophication and have installed nutrient removal systems throughout. The UK has, as usual, attempted to wriggle out and has defined only limited areas, mostly concerned with domestic water supply, as sensitive to eutrophication. We forget that lakes provide other services than domestic water supply, that all runoff goes to the sea, and that estuaries and coastal waters can be eutrophicated too. Another major point source is the waste from farm stock. Quite a lot of that can be similarly treated, especially where the animals are intensively housed. At 9 cows per person, a modern dairy herd of several hundred animals is equivalent to a large village. We would not dream of failing to serve such a village with sewage treatment. We have at present the Catchment Sensitive Farming Initiative, which spends quite a lot of money in selected catchments on capital schemes for managing manure, but as far as I can see, has not yet made very much, if any, impact on the ecology of the rivers. What is needed is a farm waste water treatment directive with much less scope for wriggling out than the urban one. But of course, farm animals also graze in fields, and so they should. And there are diffuse sources of nutrients that inevitably wash off in rain, of which we shall undoubtedly have more in bigger bursts of greater erosive capacity as the climate change marches inexorably on. We tend to think of crop agriculture as the main source of diffuse nutrients, but export coefficient modelling suggests that crops are the third source in line of diffuse nutrients in the UK, after farm stock first and septic tanks second. I think that all the suggestions for minimising nutrient flows from both pasture and crop agriculture are laudable and very well intentioned, but they are not practiced by most farmers, who are content to bank the farm payments and do little in return, according to the extensive research carried out by George Monbiot. But I also think these laudable practices won't make much difference to the problem anyway. The key change is the destruction of natural vegetation that removes the recycling and conservation mechanisms that intact forest has, and which make all lakes in undisturbed catchments, even on the most weatherable rocks, intensely nutrient poor. Use of fertilizers does not just boost yields, it is absolutely necessary to maintain any agriculture at all, because agricultural land is inherently leaky. Crops have no nutrient conservation mechanisms. If nutrient losses from farmland are therefore inevitable, is there not a good argument for using precipitants to remove phosphate from lakes? If the disease is not curable, you can at least make life more comfortable for the patient. My answer is still no. The real answer is to reduce the amount of farmland. I need to digress from lakes here for a moment. If we are to halt climate change, we not only have to reduce annual carbon emissions severely, we have to reduce them to the point that they are lower than annual storages. That is patently obvious to an ecologist or a biogeochemist, but I have yet to come across a politician or policymaker who realized it. The only cheap and efficient storages are in biomass and peat, in forest and in wetlands. Agricultural land is a net emitter, not a storage. On the latest figures, to balance emissions and storages, we would need to convert about 1/3 of current agricultural and pasture land back to forest and wetland. It could be less if we reduce emissions severely, but we have not yet succeeded in doing that at all. And the calculations also assume that existing storages remain intact. We are still destroying forest, and experiments show that as temperatures increase, community respiration rates increase more rapidly than gross photosynthesis, which means that existing storages must decline. However one looks at it, restoration of natural ecosystems on a large scale will be essential. The inevitable decline in food production will have to be adjusted to by changes in diet, which will of course be good for us, and reduction of the colossal amount of food waste we now tolerate. The food industry, I believe, is in for a big shake-up. From the point of view of lakes, all that is very good news. It eventually restores about 1/3 of the catchments to a state where they will no longer leak nutrients. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it will eventually have to happen. Meanwhile, we have to emulate the process as far as we can, on as large a scale as we can, in the farmlands that will remain. Buffer zones are one approach, but they're no good if they're a token 5 or 10 meters along the side of a few streams. They need to have both good phosphorus storage and denitrification potential, which means they have to be large, with both forest and wetland. We have to think in terms of 50 or 100 meters, and in terms of reinstating whole floodplain wetlands. Of course, it means annoying the National Farmers Union. It means compulsory land purchase. And it means courage and understanding on the parts of governments, qualities that at the moment they singularly lack. At present, no world leader has the right educational background to solve the real problems we face. 75% of 194 world leaders come from business, economics, the political route, law, the military, and hard engineering. Only one has any sort of environmental background. Things will have to change there too. Meanwhile, let's get back to the more than half of the waters in the EU that fail to meet good ecological status, often on account of their phosphorus concentrations being too high. It is argued that therefore we have to do something rapidly to save national pride in the quality of our waters. National pride can be a bit like the colourful and epauletted, gold-braided dashing uniforms of the rulers of Ruritania in musical comedies. All show and no substance. Let me tell you another story. I live close to a large sand dune system, justifiably declared in part as a national nature reserve, the rest as local nature reserves. Conservation in the UK is largely species orientated and dedicated to maintaining what were forested areas as traditional grasslands where minority species may thrive better and where the mosaic of managed habitats collectively gives a high biodiversity. But nature does not like this and does its best to restore the forest. Much effort is therefore expended in combating this. On the National Nature Reserve for the past 20 years, sheep have been grazed in winter, but no one looked at the monitoring data. When this was done, it turned out that sheep have no effect at all, and rabbits do the job. The problem, though, is that on the adjacent local reserve, used by about 1,000 people a day to walk their dogs, there is a proposal to fence it in and graze sheep in winter, regardless of the scientific evidence showing that this is pointless. Quite a lot of money changes hands to support the fencing scheme, and the local council, as a landowner, is severely short of funds and eager to have the payments. The dog walkers are livid, and an open landscape will be enclosed effectively forever. But it is argued that under the Habitats Directive, the land is currently assessed as unfavourable declining and must legally be returned to at least unfavourable recovery. Just putting sheep on, even if they do nothing, allows this. It's a device that simply ticks a box without achieving anything, though much better approaches involving the fostering of the rabbit population have been proposed. The parallel is that under present circumstances, symptom treatment of lakes to try to achieve the standard set for good ecological quality under the Water Framework Directive is also box ticking. The lakes will not be returned to good ecological quality at all. There are several reasons why. The first is that despite the best efforts of some of our colleagues in the Environment Agency, the standards for phosphorus in the reference state are still 2 to 3 times higher than in genuinely undisturbed catchments, where values for total P are generally lower than 10 micrograms per litre, even in the most naturally fertile sites. And the standards for the good moderate boundary, which is the one that matters for achieving good status, have been set at 15 to 75 for different lake types. For rivers, complete anarchy seems to have reigned. Standards have only been set to soluble in organic phosphorus and are currently 20 to 50 micrograms per litre for high and 150 to 250 for the good moderate boundary. Values for total P would be twice or more as much as these, and clearly these values equate good quality with substantial nutrient pollution. The second reason is that the spirit of the directive has not been respected. Annex 5 prescribes that a whole range of chemical, physical, hydrological, morphological and biological variables be used to assess ecological status. That acknowledges that each variable is to some extent independent and offers the challenge of combining them together to give a whole view. But that has not been done. The biological variables, where they have been established, have been calibrated against phosphorus. So all we have now is a set of crude measures of phosphorus, which is no advance on simply a single chemical measurement. Admittedly, the directive also torpedoes itself by using the one-out, all-out criterion, which effectively assumes an independence of variables that is not ecologically realistic. But the upshot is that the idea will grow in administrative and government circles that as long as the phosphorus level is reduced to the liberally high standard set for the good moderate boundary, the lake will have been restored to good status. The box will have been ticked and no further action will be needed. Therefore, if a quick fix with phosphorus precipitant will do the trick, the GDP will benefit and Britain will have emerged from the status of an environmental banana republic. But it will just be a trick. We already have the precedent that increasing pH in acidified upland waters has not been followed by much biological recovery. Lake systems do not run on phosphorus alone. They run on some hundreds of thousands of substances, many of them trace organics, and not least nitrogen, which is a key to determining plant diversity, but for which no standards have been prescribed for fresh waters under the Water Framework Directive in the UK. Lakes also comprise some millions of organism interactions in food webs that are strongly influenced by fish predation, as well as by availability of nitrogen and phosphorus. And increasingly they are affected by climate change, one of whose influences is to intensify the symptoms of eutrophication. The phosphorus box may be ticked, but Pandora's box will still be wide open. But the worst aspect is that I suspect that no one in government and few in the boards of its agencies really care about the meaning of ecological status. They are all government appointees and few, around 5%, have any ecological background. I can see them all being hoodwinked by a technical and chemical fix that will simply make the statistics look better. I have some doubts about the state of the scientific establishment too. My third bit of parallel thinking comes from the well-known story by Hans Christian Andersen of the Emperor's New Clothes, in which the Emperor's vanity and that of his courtiers and the credulence of the populace allows a couple of trickster weavers to swindle him out of a lot of money for clothes that are so fine that they feel weightless. Indeed so, because they do not exist at all, and it takes a politically naive but ruthlessly honest child to point out the fact. Sometimes we convince ourselves that things are significant because we weave myths around them. Often we do this by giving them grand names. Geo-engineering has been widely used to refer to grandiose schemes for mitigating climate change, such as fertilizing the oceans with iron, suspending particles in the atmosphere, or burying charcoal in the soils. I doubt that any of these schemes will be globally effective, and some are completely bonkers. But at least global reach is their intention. To refer to adding precipitants to lakes as geoengineering is amusing, but it wrongly glorifies what is a simple symptom treatment on a par with throwing in algicide, or removing fish in biomanipulation, or using aerators to periodically mix the water. By raising the status of lake dosing through a grandiose term, we convey the message to government and administration that this is a really important thing to do. They then are lulled into thinking that nothing else is necessary. These are times when the ruthless honesty of the child is needed in the scientific establishment, or we will continue the game playing that keeps us hurtling down the road to a very uncertain future.